Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President, Chief Historian, and Director of the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Pam Schaffler, Chair of the Board of Trustees, all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. As many of you know, we launched the Center for Women's History in early 2017. It is the first initiative of its kind in the nation within the walls of a major museum. Now, even during this challenging time of COVID-19, we remain committed to exploring the lives and legacies of women who have shaped and continue to shape the American experience. Which brings me to today's historic keynote conversation, Women in Journalism Since the Good Girls Revolt. It is part of the 6th annual Diane and Adam E. Max Conference on Women's History, Breaking News, Breaking Barriers, Women in American Journalism. The format for this year's conference will be a little different, consisting of a series of conversations and panels, which we will air over the course of our related exhibition, Cover Story, Katharine Graham, CEO. I am delighted and honored to introduce today's extraordinary panel. Lynn Povich became Newsweek's first woman senior editor in 1975, following 2 sex discrimination complaints filed by female staffers against the magazine, the first women in the media to sue. Her 2012 book, The Good Girls Revolt, describes their historic case and inspired a 2016 Amazon series. Povich became editor-in-chief of Working Woman magazine in 1991 and managing editor East Coast of MSNBC.com in 1996. A recipient of the Matrix Award for Magazines and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Washington Press Club, Povich is chair of the advisory committee of the International Women's Media Foundation and serves on the advisory board of the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Lynn will be in conversation with Rebecca Traister, writer at large for New York Magazine. A national award winner, she has written about women in politics, media, and entertainment from a feminist perspective for The New Republic and Salon, and has also contributed to The Nation, The New York Observer, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. She is the author of Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger, and All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women, and the Rise of an Independent Nation, both New York Times bestsellers, and the award-winning Big Girls Don't Cry, the election that changed everything for American women. Welcome, Lynn and Rebecca.
Thank you, Valerie. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for doing this. And thank you to the New York Historical Society for sponsoring this terrific conference on women in history.
Yes, it is a pleasure and honor to be here in this context and in this conversation with you, Lynn. And I want to start by taking you back to the beginning of your career in journalism, which began in the mid-'60s after you had graduated from college. And your father had been was a journalist. And you graduated from Vassar in 1965. Is that right?
That's right, a long time ago.
and went pretty immediately to join the Paris Bureau of Newsweek magazine. Can you tell us about, can you describe those early years of your career?
Yes, so I didn't want to be a journalist. I just wanted to go to Paris. So I applied actually to a lot of different places, including Pan Am and TWA and Newsweek and Time. And I did get an interview at Newsweek because my father was a sports columnist for the Washington Post, and he did arrange for that. They had no job there, so I was just going to go. But when I got there, before I got there, I wrote to the bureau. I was interviewed in New York. They offered me a job in New York. I said I was going to Paris, and they said there were no jobs, but write to the bureau chief. I did. There were no jobs, and I was just going to go. And right after I graduated from Vassar, actually, I got a telegram saying his secretary had quit and there was now a position. So I started at Newsweek in 1965 as a secretary in a Paris bureau. I worked there for 18 months and came back to New York. Because I had been working for Newsweek, they said that I could have a job back in New York as a researcher. Now I have to describe what the news magazine structure was like, because unlike a newspaper where you go out, you report, you write the story, and you fact check your story, one person does all that. When Henry Luce created Time in 1923, he actually segregated the jobs so that writers in New York wrote all the stories, but reporters reported all the stories, whether they were in New York or out in the field, and sent files to New York for the writer. And then researchers would fact check the story. Newsweek just copied the same structure. And it was not only the jobs were segregated by function, they were segregated by gender, so that all the reporters, the writers and editors were men, and only women were hired as researchers. So when I came to Newsweek in 1966, I became a researcher in the life and leisure section. And there were probably 50 of us, all highly educated women who were hired to fact check men who had also been graduating from the same schools we had. And that's how it was until one of our friends, Judy Gingold, who was a Phi Beta Kappa from Smith and a Marshall Scholar and could only find a job as a fact checker, fact-checking guys who were neither Marshall Scholars or Phi Beta Kappa grads, talked to a woman lawyer one day and explained our jobs. And the woman said to her, you know, it's illegal to segregate jobs by gender. And Judy didn't believe her, called the EEOC. And the woman explained, yes, it was true. And Judy said, I don't think the men know that. And because we didn't. And the woman said, if you tell the men, they will promote 2 women and that will be the end of it. So that started us. Judy came back, we started talking to each other. I was the 5th woman brought into this group. And because we were organizing under the noses of our bosses who could have fired us if they had found out, we had to do it in secret. So each of us took one other woman. We got to be 15. We hired Eleanor Holmes Norton, now the delegate from the Washington, D.C. She was then the number 2 with the ACLU. And we started organizing and figuring out how to file a sex discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunities Committee. In January of 1970, the bosses of Newsweek decided that the women's movement was becoming a big thing, and Newsweek should do a cover story on the women's movement, but they had no women to write it. So they went outside for the first time in its 37-year history and hired a woman, a very star writer at the New York Post, to come and write the piece. Well, we decided that was the perfect moment to announce our action. And so on Monday, March 16th, 1970, when Newsweek appeared on the newsstands with a cover story that said Women in Revolt, 46 of us announced that we were filing a sex discrimination suit against Newsweek. And of course, the story got picked up everywhere, which is, as good journalists, we know that the publicity will get them faster than anything else.
That's right. You've got to have a peg. You had the perfect peg. And I want to go back a little bit and ask you, when you enter that bureau in 1966, and I'm thinking here, I'm very curious about this question of consciousness and raising consciousness. When you entered in that role as a researcher in 1966, were you yourself, Lynn, frustrated by? Did you have the language and the personal frustration at that point about the limitations on your work and the inequity in the office? Or was that something that you came to through the legal conversation about whether or not it was allowed? And I guess the related question is, to what extent were you engaged with the women's movement and as it was building in that period of years, 1960 to 1970, when you're part of the suit?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, I knew that women, the researchers, were never promoted. That was clear. You knew what was going to happen. I was unusual in that I had a very good boss, a man, who encouraged me and promoted me and gave me a lot of reporting and helped me in my files. So I wasn't particularly frustrated in my personal work. But when I started covering the women's movement as a young reporter, the Congress to Unite Women in 1969, I remember, was a big turning point. I think all of us, all the researchers were aware of what was going on in society. And it suddenly occurred to us, remember, we are post-war women. We were raised in the culture to believe that we should get married and have kids and support our husbands. And we all went to good schools, but the word career was never mentioned in those schools. So we were all learning this on the job. Some people, like Judy Gingold, the woman who started it, always felt the injustice and was in consciousness raising groups, as a few of us were, but most were not. We were getting it from the social movement, from the women's movement. And I think that when Judy came back and told us that it was actually illegal what Newsweek was doing, that was my click moment. I felt the injustice then, that we absolutely had to do something. Other women felt it earlier. There were women who, for example, were reporting on John Lindsay. There was Pat Linden, who was being published in other papers. She was reporting on John Lindsay. And when John Lindsay went to the Republican convention to be a candidate for the Republican Party, her files were given to a man to write the story. So there were women at Newsweek feeling this injustice much more than I was.
Did you have anxieties at that point about the melding of the kind of stories that you as a journalist and as a researcher were covering the women's movement? You were also professionally engaging in its legal battle. And this is a period in which, and we can talk about this later as we progress, in which there was supposed to be a sharp division between the kind of social movements that you're covering and the ideology that backs those social movements and the work as a journalist, which was at that point traditionally understood to be objective. Did you feel that tension yourself as somebody who was both participating in the social movement and a legal battle and covering the social movement?
Well, I was participating in my consciousness. We were not allowed to demonstrate. We were not allowed to be part of any of these activities. And I do remember, trying to be extremely careful in my reporting and writing about my feelings about it. But I also remember that I wrote a piece after Stonewall about the gay uprising. And I remember that they said that the piece was too sympathetic. Mm-hmm. And so it was re-edited, as Newsweek would do, to take out what they felt were too sympathetic issues that I was raising.
It's interesting because this is also the period, exactly the same years in which, for instance, at New York Magazine, Gloria Steinem, who had been a reporter covering politics and the civil rights movement, goes to a speak out, an abortion speak out, and finds her consciousness raised and changed and moves increasingly away from journalism and toward activism because she felt at that point that there was no real practical way to combine the two. So this is happening for this generation of young women in journalism in roughly the same period. I want to ask you about race. And you've described the gender segregation at Newsweek and within journalism. Can you describe a little bit about what the racial breakdown there was?
Well, there were very few people of color. There were a few Blacks at Newsweek. By the way, our profession is still horrendously bad on this issue. How many, 40, 50 years later?
Right, which is one of the reasons I want to raise this, because I think it's so germane to what we're talking about right now.
I mean, we're still doing a very bad job. There were probably 5 Black women researchers, and there was one woman a Black woman who was an excellent reporter, who actually left to become the editor of Essence. And there may have been 1 or 2 Black guys in the bureaus, all of whom graduated, from Harvard or Yale. I mean, those were the Black people who were hired at Newsweek at the time. It's interesting, when we were organizing, we asked the Black researchers to join us in our actions, and they thought about it, and they decided that they would not, because I think they felt, now remember, this is 1969, So the Black movement was very much alive and extremely active. And I think they said that they felt if they were ever going to be part of an action at Newsweek, it would be for race. It would be about the Black movement and not necessarily our movement. They explained that, yes, they certainly wanted to get ahead in their careers, but they also had other issues that our particular group weren't dealing with. They had issues about race and culture. They had issues about the Black family. They had issues about Black men and Black women. And so they decided not to. And, you know, we were represented by a Black lawyer, Eleanor Holmes Norton. And for some reason, the communication between Eleanor and the fact that these women decided not to join us missed. And Eleanor always felt that if she had known, she would have convinced them to join us, because Eleanor was one of many Black women who actually were part of the women's movement. And they were part of a group that was called, they wrote a Black feminist manifesto. They believed that all women should be part of the women's movement, but somehow the communication missed.
It's one of the things that's so interesting, because I was thinking about the fact, you know, that Eleanor Holmes Norton represented you. And as you say, she was actually, she was a civil rights activist. She'd been an organizer with SNCC and had worked with Medgar Evers. And in fact, the same year that your suit was launched, that she filed suit on behalf of the Women of Newsweek, she also published a piece in, you know, part of the anthology Sisterhood is Powerful. She published a piece where she wrote, if women were suddenly to achieve equality with men tomorrow, Black women would continue to carry the entire array of utterly oppressive handicaps associated with race. So, and I think that this, this conversation about where coalition happened and where it didn't is so crucial to understanding some of the ways in which journalism, moving on from your suit, would continue to evolve, in some of the ways in which it has remained completely segregated, like deeply segregated, in ways that are very much at the heart of how we read journalism and the stories that are told today. I wanted to just point out one thing before we move into the next part of your career and what you did, how things did change for women in journalism in the wake of your lawsuits. I want to point out the degree, you know, when we talk about some of this history, I think sometimes we miss the structural costs of discrimination. It's not always made clear how much is lost when you narrow a professional pool. And what happens when you talk about newsrooms or industries or politics that are still run predominantly by men and that are still predominantly white, in addition to there being just sort of, it's unfair and it's unjust, the kinds of losses that discrimination entails. And Newsweek makes it really clear, because among the researchers, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but among the researchers who were never going to be, had you not sued and changed conditions, among those female researchers who were never going to be promoted were you, Nora Ephron, who was there before you, Ellen Goodman, Susan Brownmiller, women who, in fact, did go on to have extraordinary culture-shaping careers in journalism, as writers, in Nora Ephron's case, in film, who, had there not been legal challenge to these forms of discrimination, might well have never been promoted into positions where they might write and flourish as professional writers.
That's true. And what's interesting is that they figured out right away that they weren't going to be writers at Newsweek and left. But I will say, one of the things, you know, we did this because we actually loved Newsweek. It was a great place to work. And it was very progressive, considered liberal at the time. We wanted to make it better for women at Newsweek. We didn't want to leave Newsweek. But what we did realize, one of the consequences of our action was it actually inspired women in lots of other places to start organizing. So 3 months because of our suit, 3 months after we filed, the women at Time, the women at Fortune, the women at Sports Illustrated all filed suits. And then the floodgates opened and women started organizing and filing suits at the Associated Press, the New Haven Register, the New York Times in 74, the Washington Post in 74, NBC, and other places. At the networks, they started forming, and whether they filed or not, the threat of filing actually opened up a lot of opportunities for women. You know, it would have happened eventually, but certainly our complaint started all of that and beginning to change, create opportunities for women journalists in the 70s.
So within 5 years of the suit, you're an editor at Newsweek. Can you talk about how you experienced being, you were a first, and I guess for a period, were you only?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, first and only. Can you talk about how the profession evolved? You just described how there was the floodgates opened and these kinds of actions and shifts began to happen throughout the profession, but it was still a relatively lonely path.
Well, it was lonely in the middle management ranks for any woman who had been promoted. But I will say that one thing that happened fairly quickly, because there were so many women who were already working. They might have been working on the women's pages, but there were a lot of women at newspapers who were very experienced reporters. And so once the floodgates opened and people realized, oh, we can't keep them back anymore, women started covering business, covering foreign affairs, going to bureaus, foreign bureaus, White House. Eleanor Clift, who started as an office manager at the Atlanta bureau, and then covered Jimmy Carter. When he went to the White House, she started covering the president. All of the other women had covered first ladies. And only she and Helen Thomas were the only two women starting to cover presidents. So women were getting out of the women's pages, out of the feature pages, and into much more what we considered hardcore parts of our profession, and showing that they had the chops to do the job. And I think that is really sort of what you see today. I mean, I'm amazed when I turn on television and I see foreign correspondents, the majority of whom now are women, covering the Arab countries, all of whom are Arab speakers. So that really happened in the mid to late 70s. But Rebecca, you should talk now about what happened after my generation, because our generation was about getting women into these jobs. We couldn't even get into these jobs. Mm-hmm. But your generation started in these jobs and then evolved. So pick up sort of what happened after us.
Well, it's very interesting because you're right, in part because of these major legal victories, my generation, and again, I want to specify, particularly as a middle-class white woman, there was not a sense for me that there was a barrier between me and getting a job in journalism. But I will say that in the wake of sort of the eruptive feminist victories of the 1970s, the country had culturally moved into a period of, and this has been well documented, of tremendous anti-feminist backlash. So I was raised in a world where, as a young white woman, there was the sense that I could, my college, I mean, I got a liberal arts education, but there was the sense there was no profession that I was barred from, that I didn't grow up with any sense that there was a structural limit on my professional potential. But I also grew up in a period where to look at the world from a feminist perspective was tremendously out of fashion. It's hard for me to describe how out of fashion. In some ways, I think that even though the legal, the logistical possibilities had been completely exploded and changed for some women, the mentality wasn't so different in certain ways from a post-war mentality, right? Feminism, and to worry about achievement through or parity through a gendered lens was just like phenomenally uncool when I was a teenager. And so there was no sense, I grew up very interested in gender, but largely from an academic point of view. And the broader cultural attitude was, in fact, these things have been fixed, right? There's gender parity. We're post-feminist. It's done. You don't have to worry about this anymore. And to do so is to be sort of infantile and hysterical. I went into journalism sort of by accident in my mid-20s. It was not, I hadn't dreamt of being a journalist or anything. And it's fascinating to me, the point that you make about once you get women in journalism and the fights to cover presidents instead of just first ladies, as journalists, our job is to tell stories about the world. So there's one layer where the questions of inequity are about our own workplaces and who is in the position to do the storytelling. And then the next layer is, who are we telling the stories about? And how do the inequities of the world get reflected in the journalism? And one of the things, I began as a fact checker at a researcher at a weekly newspaper, the New York Observer. And I, at that point, even though that paper is quite a quirky paper full of a lot of voice, I was actually taught very strictly to not include anything of my opinions, maybe the paper's voice, but not my own. Nobody cared what I thought. I was trained very traditionally at that paper as a fact checker, and then as I was taught to be a reporter there. And I was reporting at that time on the film industry in New York City, and actually was assigned for a period to be a gossip columnist. And I was just taught how to report the mechanics of it, like plumbing, very old-fashioned journalism education. And then in 2003, I got a job at Salon, which was an online publication. It still exists. And I got a job essentially on a modern version of the women's pages. My job was to be the life writer, and it was to cover all of the categories that sort of were feminized. It wasn't political reporting. It wasn't business. It wasn't science. It wasn't film criticism. It was sex, children, education, anything sort of that could be tied to the female sphere. And it was basically being the ladies' pages writer. And that was in 2003. And one of my first jobs in that election cycle was to cover the presidential election, but my job was to cover Teresa Heinz Kerry, Judy Steinberg Dean, who was Howard Dean's wife, the two Kerry daughters when John Kerry was the candidate. And so it's very funny that however many decades later, there were women covering John Kerry, although not so many then, right? But my job was to cover the wives and the daughters because they were the women to be covered. So the segregation of a political world and the inequities of the political world wound up getting reflected in the shape of my career. Now, in that period, 2003 and 2004, I began to write some things from a feminist perspective. I was encouraged at Salon, which was not a traditional newspaper and was very heavy on opinion, criticism, and saw a sort of place for reporting to be shaped by opinion. And I was encouraged to include my point of view in my writing, even when I was reporting stories. And so I began to experiment a little bit with bringing a feminist perspective into my writing. And it got, after these couple of decades of real anti-feminist deep freeze, I think there was an appetite for some feminism back in mainstream media. And some of the pieces that I was writing, a lot of them cultural criticism and things just told from a feminist perspective, it got a lot of traffic, which of course is the currency of the realm in journalism and in online journalism. You want hits. And so I was encouraged to keep writing from a feminist perspective, and I got to develop my beat. But again, part of what I was covering, it depended on the inequities of the world. And so I was covering the spouses and the daughters. And then in 2006, my editor said to me, Hillary Clinton may run for president in 2008, and you have to write about her, which I didn't want to do. I was not a fan of Hillary Clinton at that point in my career. But it was fascinating because that was it.
Yeah.
When a woman ran for president as a serious contender, and she was, I mean, I think ridiculously regularly labeled inevitable as the Democratic candidate for the presidency in 2008, suddenly I, who had not been trained to be a straightforward political reporter or even a political commentator, suddenly I was covering a candidate for president because a woman was running for the candidate for president, and I covered women. So that's how I came to write about politics, and not just the wives and daughters, but the candidates themselves and the races that they were in.
Yeah, it's very interesting because women journalists are doing two kinds of journalism today. I mean, you just explained the kind that you're doing through a feminist lens. And because women are now in these positions of power, as in terms of being reporters, they're still not running anything, but they certainly are powerful reporters. You do have women who have, because they are women, are covering stories that wouldn't have been covered. So at the New York Times, for example, you have women covering shifts workers, women who work these horrible shifts and have children at home and nobody covers them, lack of childcare, and of course, the Me Too movement, which Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor broke at the New York Times in a very traditional way. They did deep investigative reporting. Because they were women, other women spoke to them, and they were able to figure out how to put all this together about Harvey Weinstein. And that continues today. And yet, you, for example, if we can take the current crisis going on with Governor Cuomo, it's interesting to me, for example, how you approached it versus the mainstream news media, shall we say. They did investigative stories about the women who came forward, and they did investigative stories about people complaining about his office culture. But when you wrote the story, you were able to synthesize both of those aspects and talk about it as a power thing and not as a sex harassment case.
Yes. And I think that I have certain freedoms. I have crafted a role for myself in journalism that I'm not the only one who has it. I think there are a lot of people who are writing with a little bit more flexibility about our ability to contextualize the things we're reporting on. So I am, in many cases, I am sometimes an opinion columnist. I sometimes write what I think about a given situation. Sometimes, sometimes with real anger, sometimes with humor, and some of my columns are entirely my point of view. They are reported insofar as I am a reporter and I care very deeply about getting facts absolutely correct. It's, this is my early training remains with me. And in that way, I'm a very traditional reporter. But then there are other periods where I do investigative reporting. And the piece that I just wrote about Andrew Cuomo and his workplace behavior and its connection to his governance was a really deeply reported piece in an old-fashioned way, hours and hours and hours on the phone with dozens of people who worked with and adjacent to him. But because I have a sort of a non-traditional according to the older ideas about strict objectivity in journalism, because I can bring some analysis, including power analysis, into the conversation, I have a little bit more freedom to help contextualize in my own words, in a story that is deeply reported and includes many sources, many of them on the record with new information that hasn't been reported elsewhere. I have the freedom to situate those stories a little bit more within an analysis, an analytical framework of why and how power abuse matters, and what it has to do with inequity, and then connect it to governance. So I would say that I have more freedom than probably previous generations of journalists. And I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of other journalists out there at other publications perhaps not so much still at newspapers, right? There, it depends on, I write for a magazine, and getting to write a magazine feature makes a big difference. My Andrew Cuomo story was 9,000 words. That's a huge feature with a lot of space for both the reporting and the context and the analysis. One of the fascinating things that I did report on and found in reporting that Andrew Cuomo story that I think ties directly to these issues that we're talking about right now is there's a question of how has the governor of New York behaved in a lot of these ways out in the open for years, and they've never been cast, these behaviors have never been cast as problematic until now. And there are a lot of answers to that question. But one of the chief ones is the makeup of the Albany press corps. And I actually quoted a couple people in my story discussing this. The number of people, the people who cover Albany and state government there, are overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. And there are a couple of people who I quote in that story, and others who have written about it in separate pieces, who actually discuss the connection between what you're talking about. When women are the journalists, they're able to, whether or not they're doing it through an opinion piece or analysis, they are seeing the story and the power dynamics in the story perhaps slightly differently than men and then white men. And so one of the answers as to how has this behavior been allowed to flourish without critical reporting on it, I think has to do with the makeup of the particular core of reporters who have been covering the governor and the women there. I talked to a bunch of female reporters who discussed exactly how hard it has been to do this kind of reporting in a professional sphere where they are the minority.
Interesting. I wanted to raise something because this is a development that came way after my generation. And that is the problem for women journalists with social media. I'm very involved with the International Women's Media Foundation, and we just started an online violence hub because 70% of women journalists have reported that they have been harassed online, threatened. And I know that as a woman journalist, when you are putting your pieces out there, your reporting out there, that there is a lot of backlash and threats and hate that come with being a woman. And I just thought maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I know newspapers and magazines are putting some protections in place for people who are reporting online for women. But what has been your experience?
It's been pretty bad, although not as bad as some people's. I mean, ever since I started writing at Salon, which was online, where the accessibility and some of these forces, it's very confusing because there is social media and being online is a democratizing and I think beneficial thing for journalism, but there's much more access and it's much quicker. There's for people who want to yell at people and threaten them, it's much easier to do so via the click of a button than it was when you had to write a letter, or make a phone call. And so from the start of my career, I got incredibly nasty, vulgar correspondence, first in comment sections, and then eventually as things moved to Twitter and Facebook and some of the social media platforms. Yes, it's for me what has always characterized the nature of that kind of stuff has been vulgarity and yes, threats. But I will also say that they have lessened as I have gotten older. And they have lessened as I have gotten more senior in my profession, which is an indication to me that, again, so much of this is about power. And I know that the threats are worse for younger women. They are much worse for women of color, much worse for Black women. It is, and it's a very, I would like to see more protections put in place, but for publications, it's very fraught because they want their reporters and their writers to be out on social media, again, getting traffic, getting attention. So for those who want to profit from the content, the actual work that journalists are doing, there is a collision of priorities, because institutions are invested in having their female reporters, who are often doing some of the most groundbreaking and explosive work out there, especially around issues of inequity, to be out there advertising that work and to be talking about it and helping it to make the impression that they want it to make. And yet, by being out there, those women are also incurring a tremendous cost and putting themselves at risk, real risk. And so this is a real conundrum. I should say my institution has been wonderful when I have gotten threats. And the worst, honestly, there is a degree to which it's so common and so constant that you do develop a thick skin to some of the, or I shouldn't speak for anybody else, to some of the vulgarity and insult. And again, I say that as somebody who is aware that what I've experienced is much less than what many other people have experienced. But there are times, postcards to your home address and texts to your home phone, where the availability of contact information and location information in a very violent world makes it chilling. And my institution has been wonderfully responsive when I've had those instances and gone to them, and but nothing that an institution does can fully remove the fear that is provoked by that kind of response. And yes, it is absolutely targeted. Anecdotally, and in terms of the coverage that I've read about it, women are targeted most violently and most vulgarly, and are most at risk. And then those risk factors increase based on race and age and class.
And I just want to say, here we are in 2021, and except for CBS News, there's not a woman running a news organization. There have been periods when there have been, but not anymore. And I think that that's one of the big challenges still left for women journalists today, is to get women in the power positions to make all those kinds of decisions.
And I think that goes back to the very first warning. And this is not to suggest that there hasn't been radical, enormous progress, because we've just talked about how much there's been. But I want to go back to that thing that you're told at the beginning, which is, the warning. They'll promote 2 women and then say they've done enough, right? And obviously we are like miles and miles, hundreds of miles beyond that. And we've talked about women having so many more jobs, but sometimes the most visible jobs, right? The women we see on TV covering the president, can give the impression, again, that it's fixed. When in fact, you have these institutions where power is still so exclusively held by men, so tightly held by white men. And we have to note that so many of the women who have gotten jobs also are predominantly white. We touched on this earlier, but while we have made tremendous progress when it comes to gender, a lot of it has been white women getting the jobs. White women were the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action policies throughout the 70s across many professions, but including in the media. And so the fact that we have made progress should not actually be used to obscure the enormous progress that still must be made if we are to have a media and newsrooms that are actually representational of the people and the stories that they cover.
I agree. I feel very hopeful actually at this moment, because I was an affirmative action baby. I wouldn't have gotten my job certainly as quickly or even at all without affirmative action. And I do feel that we are at a moment now of affirmative action for people of color. I'm very hopeful that with this laser attention being paid to the inequities within all of these professions, businesses, corporations, organizations, that people are finally, since the 60s, looking again at how white everything is. And I'm very hopeful that there will be some movement, never enough, but some movement on that issue.
There must be if we are to have the good journalism that we want to have in the world, we can't have that journalism. We can't tell these stories well or truthfully until we have a media that is actually capable of telling them well. And that means breaking up the unequal monopolies of power within the media.
Well, on that inspiring and hopeful note, thank you both so very much, Lynn Povich, Rebecca Traister, for being with us today. What an incredible conversation. We are so privileged to have you. Our Max Conference series, Breaking News, Breaking Barriers, Women in American Journalism, will continue throughout Women's History Month and beyond. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on the series. And finally, we hope to see you all on Central Park West in person to view Cover Story, Catherine Graham, CEO, opening on May 21st in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery. Until then, thank you all and good night.